Evening and welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast.
I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sansbury.
Good evening, and as many of our watchers and listeners know, we're not afraid to try and take the dullest of subjects and make it interesting. So we have given ourselves the we've given ourselves the challenge this week of getting the Portsmouth City Council budget to be both spicy, zesty, and lively. But unfortunately, the best laid plans. We had the wonderful Jerry the Inquisitor Brown joining us this evening as our kind of scrutinizer of things fiscal. But unfortunately, Jerry has had to nip away for a family-based emergency. So our thoughts are with Jerry. But we have got some topics we'll kick about with him on a future show for definite.
Yeah. So yes, I hope things work out, Jerry. And we'll have you back on soon. Because Jerry's inquisitive mind and his questions certainly worth us revisiting those. We've certainly got a lot out of the episodes that we've done with him before. So that does just leave us, me and thee, covering Portsmouth City Council's budget meeting for that was on Tuesday for 23-24. As exciting as it was, normally we'd fill an episode like this with lots of excerpts from the budget meeting, so you get to not just hear our voices, but we can't do that, can we, Ian?
No, unfortunately, it's not just us that has technology issues. Maybe the good people of Portsmouth City Council are using a similar streaming service and somebody wasn't using the right browser. So there was no stream available live for all those that had purchased popcorn. And then there was effectively no recorded version at all, audio or visual. So we have been feeding on scraps this week in terms of what we've got recorded. And as you know, what truer representation of truth can there be than political parties' social media posts?
Yeah, because they'll be 100% accurate, won't they? We can definitely rely on them as a true record of the event itself. So shall I dive into a bit of social media exploration?
Well, I think that's not a bad thing. I think the thing we should also touch on first is, because it wasn't recorded, did it ever happen? It is alleged that the budget was voted through with a spirit of warmth, bonhomie, and general love from the four major parties, and everyone hugged each other and sung Kumbaya at the end. I might have made that last bit up, but there's no record, so it means
Yeah, I was gonna say, thankfully there isn't a record of Gerald singing Kumbaya. I'm sure he's got a fantastic singing voice. I'll turn my attentions to a bit of social media just to see how the battle was fought on social media before and after the event, and then perhaps we can go through what was suggested and talk about what actually happened.
Yes.
That sounds like a cunning place to start. So interestingly enough, when I looked at the social media from the various from the three major political parties, so that was the Lib Dems, the Conservatives, and Labour. There wasn't really anything from the Conservatives at a party level. I know there were a couple of posts from a local level from some of the wins that local councillors or indeed local prospective candidates at the local elections for May the 4th would want to celebrate. But otherwise, the Conservatives seem to be a bit quiet. There seemed to be a bit of a developing spat narrative between Labour and the Liberal Democrats. So Labour started the day basically decrying that the Lib Dems running the council are going to be making the people in Portsmouth pay more and get less. So getting less for paying more during a cost of living crisis at a time when households are at a pinch, and that they've cited there basically a news article from February last year where council leader Gerald Vernon Jackson had said that for this year he'd expect no cuts needing to be made. So obviously that being dug out from the archives, and then you can comment on whether you think that there was anything that happened after February the 3rd last year that might have
Well,
changed the economic environment at all. But
and I think that there is an element of, this is where I do find the Portsmouth Labour position slightly duplicitous because, we for our many faults, we do pay attention to what goes on. And if I go back to last May, or in fact to April, I do recall the then leader of the Labour group announcing before the elections in a loud and proud way that they would be definitely voting the Lib Dems back in after the May elections. The May elections happened and they voted the Lib Dems back in. Now, one could argue, and almost certainly would, well, they were never going to vote the Conservatives in. Very true. But there is an element of you voted them in and now you're complaining bitterly that you kind of, yeah. Am I going to use the phrase they didn't know what they were voting for?
Really? Well, I'm sure they did, but I mean, you said it yourself. What was the alternative? The alternative was them committing electoral suicide and
Yep.
voting to allow a Conservative administration, a minority Conservative administration to be formed, and they weren't going to do that because they've tried it before and it didn't work out so well for them. So I think that's the problem with first past the post. You only have the choices that you have. You don't have a way of sticking the preferences, and you can still say the one that I felt that I had to vote for because the other ones I didn't want to vote for because they're awful. I still didn't like what they did. So I guess at the end of the day, they can't really say, they're not going to say, are they? Oh, the Lib Dems have been fantastic, and we should just sit on our hands and not campaign and exist as a
No,
political party. But
no,
they didn't have an alternative for the other one, did they? I guess it's
no,
odd for me to
I,
try and defend them in this respect.
no, and I guess the thing for me, Simon, is that, and this is where I find the sort of the duplicity of politics slightly odd.
Mm.
Which is that I have absolutely no, as you say, the logic is simple. Labour did what they had to do. They held the nose. They did what they had to do. The piece which I find slightly duplicitous and kind of grinds my gear a little bit is that the social media gives you a choice as to what you choose to post. And so there's an element of you've got an option as to post all the good things that you think voting Labour can bring to you in May. But the narrative from our local Portsmouth Labour team seems to be often, they almost ignore the Conservatives and they just tear into the Lib Dems, which usually I wouldn't be disappointed in. But there is an element of, isn't this all a bit of a phony war?
Well, hold that thought.
I will do. I shall remain poised for the moment.
Like a coiled zebra. So with your thoughts of a phony war, so they then went on to post again about to revisit that statement from last year about we won't need to make savings next year, and essentially just pinning that. So your council bill is going to be going up by 4.99% this year, whilst there is a black hole of over 25 million created under their watch. So as far as their narrative is, basically, look, the reason why the council finances are in a mess are because the Lib Dems have messed up managing the finances of the council. That's their
And
argument, and they said it would be
absolutely.
okay last year, and they're not keeping their promise. That's
Well,
their argument, and it would excite if you're convinced of the view that, I mean, if you're an opposition party, your job is basically to present the narrative that you are going to do a better job than the existing administration. Um,
oh,
that's
oh
quite easy
yes.
to do
But
because no one's
again,
mm,
but this is where again I am struggling because I remember Pledge 1, because we all like a set of pledges, and I remember Portsmouth Labour's very strong. They brought it to council at least 3 times, and it was on their website. I don't know whether with change in leadership it's changed again, but it was very, very clear that We call upon Portsmouth City Council to pay everybody, either directly employed or through subcontractor, the living wage, and we expect this done this year. And if we want to talk about, and the Lib Dem Council, in their polite and nice way, said, well, we'd like to do that, but here is the £12 million hole that would open up in the finances. So we can't do that all now. Sorry. To which there was a "Huh, typical" response. So I'm just finding the whole, well, if we were in charge, this never would have happened. It is, let's be honest, and even I'll be kind about the Lib Dem Council. You
Steady
know,
on.
they're 25 million whole, if such, if that number is correct, and I haven't researched it, hasn't happened because they went down to the Tiberius casino and stuck 25 million on black and it came out red. You know, it's not like they spent it on popsicles and fun hats. We all know what's happened, which is that inflation has rocketed. With that inflation has come an awful lot of industrial unrest for significant pay rises. The minimum wage, I think, goes up by 10.2% in April. Um, there is the economic conditions are not great, and in a belt tightening way, the money coming from the horrible, nasty Tories in central government has got smaller, not larger. Throw them all into the pot, and you are where you are.
Indeed, I'll show how the comment progresses. So they then went on to post about celebrating that their budget amendment had passed, and saying that the Conservatives have cut £6 in every 10 from councils. So I think in the last 10 years, over 50% of local council tax funding, which comes from central government, has reduced. Sorry, council tax funding from central government has reduced by more than 50%. So that's where that figure is coming from.
Yeah.
And about, despite there being austerity and massive overspends by the Lib Dems, I'm not going to grade them on the erroneous apostrophe there. It was autocorrect, I'm sure. We've secured the following in today's budget meeting: 77,500 pounds for cost of living hardship fund, doubling tree canopy cover, shore power to the port, which is an interesting celebration because that was announced by the council in the news on earlier in February.
Yes.
So I'm interested to see that. Things about active neighbourhood trial, more bike hangers, funding for school streets, and funding for cycling improvements in Portsmouth. So remember some of those things as we go into a bit more detail as we look at. I'm not going to go line by line on everything, but it's
No.
interesting when you see what's been celebrated or what's being shared versus what obviously seemed to happen. So it's interesting, and someone's ahead of us in the comments, so spoilers. So yes, indeed, Emily, you're right. So what was happening on the other side of the fence? Well, the Lib Dems were talking about, before the shots were being fired, about today's budget, delivering £3.8 million support to families struggling with the cost of living crisis.
Hang about.
Yeah.
So Labour's got 77,000,
Yeah.
and the Lib Dems have found 3.8 million.
I know, it's interesting, right?
Ooh,
Are we still talking about the same budget?
yeah. Ooh, keep going.
Okay, so so Lib Dems continue to say, so on a different post, in today's budget, we're proud to be in a position to deliver to Portsmouth residents, despite the economic climate, building an extra 750 council houses, the UK's first carbon neutral port, investment in schools, income from solar panels, and city centre regeneration, with council leader Gerald Vernon Jackson quoted as saying, the council is affected by the cost of living crisis like everyone else. The government has said it will not be providing any extra funding to help with these rising costs, so we need to make our savings from within our own budget.
Oh, hang about, in the same style of scrutiny,
Hmm.
The city centre regeneration, wasn't that a whole chunk of extra wedge that was through a separate scheme that came in? Because we discussed it on the podcast before about the wisdom of whether you try and regenerate some of these high streets and town centres, or whether, in the Mauritian way, you bulldoze them flat and start again. Hmm.
There is indeed, but I suspect, knowing how long things take, that they didn't do that since Tuesday.
Ah, true, true, true.
I think project timelines of that nature are slightly longer.
No, no,
Uh,
I was merely suggesting where the money had come from, in terms of the
oh yeah,
Lib
so
Dems had bravely found it down the back of a sofa, rather than found it in a shoebox marked "For your high streets with love, the nice Conservatives, smiley face X."
oh bless you. He does try, ladies and gentlemen. No, you can't spend government grants or government funding that's for Project A on day-to-day spending or
Yep,
on other things. So yeah, you can't do that. And in fact, there are examples in Portsmouth's history that I can't specify because I can't remember them precisely,
yep,
where we had to give money back or been in danger of giving money back to the government where we've not met certain step targets to be
yep.
able to secure the rest of the money for funding. So there's that happening. So what do you think happened? What do you think else was the next thing for the Lib Dems in their social media battle?
Well, I think they've got to go pretty hard on they've got to go hard on the government, and Liz Truss is incompetent, wrecked the economy. I think they've got to go hard on the national picture. I think that's where they're going next.
Okay. Well, actually, the next post that was there was about moving Portsmouth forward this budget with over £260,000 invested in cycling across the city.
Oh, right. So £250,000 for extra bicycling. I'm holding that thought.
Yeah, hold that thought. Remember these things and remember these numbers because it's quite
Yeah.
interesting as we go along.
Yep.
And then what they closed out with was, in an unprecedented budget meeting, all parties have unanimously agreed the budget and placed the needs of Portsmouth residents over politics. When other councils are being warned of bankruptcy, the Liberal Democrats in Portsmouth continue to provide stable and reliable services for its residents and united all parties locally to achieve this.
That
So
was when they got the guitar and
yeah, yeah.
started strumming the chords to Kumbaya just at the end there.
Perhaps. So yeah, so every penny from the council tax rise is to protect social services from government funding cuts. There you go. Extra CCTV to tackle antisocial hotspots. Remember that one?
Yep.
£100,000 planting trees,
Oh,
265,000 cycling infrastructure, and 3.8 million hardship fund to support the city's most vulnerable residents. So isn't it
now
great?
again,
We all achieved this, but we were the ones that brought everyone together. And aren't we good?
yes, yes, but, and this is where I've got a numerical question mark on my virtual pad. They've got a hardship fund of 3.8 million, and Labour won a hardship fund of 77,000. Oh,
Yes. So
okay.
So, shall I make it more complicated before we make it simpler by getting into the weeds of what the amendments were?
Go on, but I think I'm ahead of you. I think I'm ahead of
Oh,
you, but go on. Go on.
okay. Okay. So there were actually four sets of amendments to the council budget, which was essentially the information that came out of the cabinet meeting on the 21st of February, so a week before the full council budget meeting. So
Yep.
there was an amendment from the Conservative group, there was an amendment from the Labour group, there was an amendment from councillors Cal Corkery and Kirsty Meller, who
Formerly part of the Labour group, who have
formerly artists formerly
been
known as
e
Labour councillors.
yep, been
And then
expelled and resigned respectively. Yep.
yes, and then there was a group amendment.
Oh,
Now the group amendment was from all of the major parties, but
oh,
obviously I'm gonna start at the very beginning. So don't worry, listeners, I am not literally going to read the budget out line by line. But essentially, The Conservatives wanted to reduce communities and central services by 66,000. Reduce culture, leisure, and economic development by 36. I said I wasn't going to go through it line by line, didn't I?
Yeah, don't do that.
Don't do that. So these were things. These were things like ceasing the publication of flagship, reorganising marketing communications at the council to lose one full-time equivalent employee, reducing the management capacity by half a full-time employee in the culture leisure portfolio, reducing leaders initiatives budget, and in traffic and transportation, reinstate existing parking tariff structure and increase each hour by 10p tariff. So those were the things that they wanted to cut.
Yep.
They also wanted to add Hills of Youth provision to combat antisocial behaviour, remove at district centres the new 30p a minute of 70p tariff for parking. 1 hour introduced at £1.50. Remove introduction of street charging in Canoe Lake, and remove introduction of street charging along Eastney Esplanade. So,
but at this point, is it? I think it's important that we kind of give people economies of scale. I don't know whether you've got a slide for that, but if you haven't, then I'm happy to talk through it.
Yeah.
In terms of the council tax revenue before the rise raised 91 million. The total budget is 174 million, so 83 million comes from elsewhere and 91 million comes through council tax. So every percentage point rise is 900,000. Now, which means that there's 2% that they've opted to put in for ring fence for social care. So there's another 3%, which is 2.7 million, which is that's the rise that they put in place. If I look at the Conservative amendments without you going into detail through them, if I'm honest with you, it's save 30k here, save 40k there, save 50k
but they're
here.
overall revenue neutral.
Yeah. So there is an element of the Conservatives, their first position or their macro position for me is no different to the Lib Dems in terms of we will give the good people of Portsmouth another year of the maxed out rise before the people of Portsmouth actually get a say on whether that, because once it goes over 5%, they've got to go to the people of Portsmouth and say, are you happy to wear this? So effectively, whilst we're jot and tittling about 30k here and 40k there is no macro difference, is there, in terms of, the big question for me is, we're talking about cost of living crisis and everything else, is can the households of the good people of Portsmouth wear another 5% rise? Because this isn't the first maxed out rise. And for me, the Conservatives are offering no alternative.
Indeed, there was no party making an amendment to argue for not needing to have that rise. And you're absolutely right. The amounts of money that and I'll go through them in turn, but obviously not entirely line by line.
Yep.
The others are actually easy to go through because there's less on them. But the actual amendment, the actual adjustment to the budget itself, it doesn't touch the sides. So as you say, for every 1% of if you wanted to not have an increase of 1%, you'd need to find an extra £903,000 worth of saving in the capital budget.
Yep.
And there's nothing that comes anywhere close to that in any of the amendments.
No.
So we are. I mean, you could say that means we're basically frittering away at the edges and playing with the little bits of, it's going up by 5%, but you've got your play park in your ward.
Well, let's see what everybody else has bid for, and then we can look
so
at
let's go with that. So the Labour group, so they wanted to transfer £260,000 from the revenue reserve for capital. and then use that to fund a £254,000 cost of living hardship fund for a year.
Ah, interesting. So two things there. One
Mhm.
is, um, again, I'm going to go for same old Labour. You know, take the family silver, your capital reserve, and sell it to pay for spending. Not keen. Um, but the number 260,000 sounds quite different, or 254 sounds quite different to 77.
Yeah, and I've noticed an error on my slide, and those of you who can count and look at the screen will notice that. So what they also did was for £6,000 delay for 1 year the basically the 30-minute 70p tariff introduced. So again, with the tariff structure at local centres, so that would have been basically added at £6,000. So their overall impact would have been £6,000. So
Right.
not quite the zero that I've got on the screen. Councillors Corkery and Mellor had a very similar story to the Labour amendment, which was instead of a £260,000 transfer from the reserve, it was a £250,000 transfer from the reserve. And that to be used as a discretionary fund for 1 year to provide school meals to low-income households that would otherwise not be entitled. Estimated that the fund would provide free school meals to circa 500 children, equating to 95,000 meals. So yeah, so again, there's those kind of differences. But then when you look at the group amendments, so once everyone had chewed over their fat,
Mm.
um, essentially what we ended up with was there was sorry, there was the changes to the estimates, so reinstating existing parking tariff structure and increase that by 10p, so effectively the Conservative amendment about the parking.
Yep.
Transfer from revenue reserve for capital, 77,500. So that transfer from the reserve that Labour
Is
wanted
a
is
is
there,
a skinny it's a skinny down version.
is a slimmer version, as you say. But that's used for a cost of living hardship fund for a year, 77,500. And removing the district centres 30-minute 70p tariff, so that would be costing 6,000. So again, revenue neutral. So this is kind of moving things out of column A into column B, right? So that's the revenue estimates and expenditures. But the interesting thing was when you look at what the capital expenditures were. So sorry
Yep.
if anybody's snoozing at this point, as you're going to sleep, could you please press the like, subscribe, or whatever button, and just leave it streaming so that our viewership carries on. Even if you're sleeping, just you don't have
Yeah.
a microphone on, so it doesn't matter if you snore. So the capital programme amendments, so reductions. The Conservatives wanted to reduce the Baffins BMX track, the Binstead play area, verge hardening, which was 50,500. They wanted to add as expenditures the Gatcombe Park play area, the College Park play area, Highbury Community Centre heat pump, one mobile CCTV for Hilsey, Anchorage Park Dragon's Teeth, that's sort of park protection, and a vehicle activated sign for Anchorage Road. Now, I should say that the CCTV for Hilsey and the Gatcombe Park play area are also being equally contributed to from the Community Infrastructure Levy Fund for those wards. So there'd
Yep.
be funding matched by those wards. But those are the so overall revenue neutral. So reduction of 50,500, an increase of 50,500, all over by the shouting.
Yep.
Labour wanted to find savings of 260,000, which was to delete the Southsea Seafront festoon lighting, the refurbishment of Hilsey basketball court, the sea defence enhancements, and the Eastney Point opportunity area, and reduce the Baffins BMX area. So if you're a BMX user in Baffins,
Baffins.
sounds like
Yeah,
people have
everyone
figured
hates
it
him. Yep.
out. But think about who are the councillors in which wards, and which
Oh,
wards
yeah.
the
Yeah,
reductions being aimed at,
yeah,
and
yeah.
who the increases in spending is being aimed
Yep,
at.
yep, yep.
The Corkery-Mellor amendment, similar to the Labour one, about the South Sea Seafront festoon lighting. They also wanted to delete the Castle Road Phase 2, and delete the unauthorised encampment expenditure. So theirs overall would have saved 250,000. So the Labour and the ex-Labour councillors were actually proposing net capital expenditure savings.
Interesting.
And the
To be
group,
fair to them, that's and again, you know, that offs effectively they were giving back the 250,000 they wanted to
yeah,
take out of capital and put in. So yeah, no, they balanced the books there. Good
yeah.
stuff.
So, so an interesting thing when you, especially when you listen to the usual narrative about different parties' financial competency, but the group, so everyone in it together, was what they agreed to do was to delete the South Sea Seafront festoon lighting, the sea defence enhancements, the Eastney Point opportunity area, reduce the Milton skate ramps, local transport plan part 4, so reduce the cost of that, reduce the spending on cycle improvements, which is interesting because didn't somebody celebrate about the amount of money spent on cycle
Mm,
improvements,
yep.
and verge hardening in Portsmouth, which was part of PIP's contribution to trying to find an agreement that would get the budget through. So overall, that was going to reduce capital expenditure by 135,000. But the additions that were still kept in were essentially all of the Conservative additions, which were about Gatcombe Park play area, the College Park play area, Highbury Community Centre heat pump. I should mention that I am a trustee at a Highbury Community Centre, but I had no impact on the budget whatsoever. And one mobile CCTV for Hilsey, and the Dragon's Teeth for Anchorage Park, and the vehicle activated sign for Anchorage Road. Interesting, that vehicle activated sign. There was I don't know if you recall, thinking back to hyper-local stuff, as part of the
Yep.
disagreement between the 2 existing Conservative councillors and the 1 Labour councillor in Cosham, about
Yes.
the best way to manage speeding in the Highbury estate, which was whether to use a vehicle activated sign. So obviously the Tories continue to believe in vehicle activated signs and want to put one into Anchorage Road as well. So those increases would be 57,500. So that gives a net reduction in capital expenditure for 77,500. So
Which
aren't we clever? We've
pays
all found
wh-
some savings. We've made everybody happy.
which pays for Labour's £77,500 cost of living hardship fund.
There we go. See,
So
it's clever, isn't it? It's
no. Well,
I knew you
and
were going to
this
say
is where I'm gonna fly against
that.
this mood of bonhomie and general warmth and loving, because
No.
and I think this is my overall frustration with this budget
Mhm.
and the approach of our local councillors. And this is a non-political point, which is, for me, everybody is trumpeting about their wins. And ultimately, for me, in this budget, everyone loses. You know, we have the situation where the council tax is being hiked again by the maximum amount it can be hiked. And there is an element of, what are you offering me in return? Oh, well, we can have a basketball court in Hilsey and some verge hardening in Paulsgrove and some CCTV in Gatcombe Park, and it just all matters nothing. You know, we're spending an extra £250,000 on cycling and £100,000 here and £77,000 on X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, well, brilliant. But when the council tax plops through my door in the next couple of weeks, it's gone up by 5% for the third, fourth year in a row.
It's certainly gone up. I don't know precisely how many years, but it's gone up that much. I think since we've started. So,
Yeah.
2.99% of that is basically the council, the base council tax levy,
Yep.
but the other 2% is directly passported to social care. So that provides for 1.8 million increase, which when you look at the cost of more, the increased wage costs, which you mentioned earlier on, which was
Yeah.
something that previously has been heavily campaigned for by opposition parties on Portsmouth City Council,
Yep.
but just to keep standing still with with existing cost of living, with the inflation that it's been over that period, and the sheer fact that adult social care is dearer because as demographically there are more people requiring adult social care and they're living longer. So that's
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
that's a
And
good thing.
there
Is
are
that
yeah.
costs more money to do.
And there is there was always this dilemma, isn't there? There's this
Mm.
tension. And the tension for me is, when you look at adult social care specifically, and we talk about, so the minimum wage has gone up 10%. And to be fair, that was called out, well over a year ago before the massive explosion in inflation was called out. So, there'll be no credit given to anyone for doing that in advance, because now people are just shrugging, so, well, it's just standing still, in fact, we're losing money. Um, there is a labour shortage in the care market, the adult social care market. And we don't like to use the B word on here, but there is an element where, at the lower end of the job market, there are fewer people looking for those jobs post Brexit. So, there's inflationary pressure there. On one hand, we say, we want care workers and we want those people at the bottom end of the earning spectrum to be earning more. Was the old dilemma of, well, somebody's got to pay for that comes into play. And I guess the bit for me, which I find frustrating about this whole budget, is it just feels lazy to me, Simon. It feels like we'll stick the 5% on top, and then we'll fiddle about in the margins. All of the political party, no one's offering a real difference or choice. We'll all fiddle about in the margins so that we've got something that we can put on our leaflets. That would be my overall verdict on this budget as a whole.
Okay. Yeah, I think the reason why no one is really suggesting a lower or indeed a no rise council tax this year, because that was in not last year, the year before, wasn't it? Um,
Yep,
the Conservatives had offered selling off some land that the council owned that was earmarked for social housing in order to
yep,
fund basically not having to do a rise that year, but it would mean that the rise would be needed, would still be needed the following year. So
yep,
there isn't any there aren't any ideas like that, but maybe that's just because, unfortunately, with central government funding, as you said yourself, if
yep,
if the original budget was what 202 million for total expenditure for the council, but the income for the budget was was 94 million for from council tax. So the rest of it comes from general grants or business rates retention or revenue support grants. So it's not, it comes from central allocations, so it's not something the council has. So to me, this talks about the argument about how our taxation system works and about how so much of council expenditure is mandated expenditure. It's things that they have to cover, and it's the right
yep.
thing that it's covered, but central government doesn't give local government the support, either financially or the power to support themselves financially in order to be able to do that. And that only leaves them with two courses of action of how to actually try to make up the gap. And one is council tax rises, which you
Yep.
said, which is not that much over 50% of or sorry, around 50% of actually the income, or they borrow money to invest in other things. And those were the things that we wanted to go to with Jerry.
Mm,
We'll come to that in a different show. But
yes.
but I think that just, to me, that says that there's something fundamentally broken about how a local government works, how it's funded. And because
Well,
whether I'm paying tax to central government or whether I'm paying tax to local government, I want local services to work. I want there to be you know, education system that works. I want there to be roads that aren't potted with loads of potholes. I want there to be all of these sorts of things. But unfortunately, there's this kind of mismatch of where you have to spend money on this, but we're not going to give you the money to fund it, but you have to spend it, and there are all of these things that are uncontrollable expenses. So there isn't. That's why you end up with. Is that not why you end up with frittering away with, or frittering around, not away, with the little things that the council does actually have some choice over spending about whether it regenerates a play park or not. When it can't do the fundamental thing of how do I manage to raise the how do I manage to raise the nearly 3 million that we would need to raise or save, so either cost avoidance or income generation, to be able to avoid that increase.
And I think it's a very valid point. And, I got into a little bit, it's not like me, but a little bit of a social media spat over this.
It's not like you.
No, it's, and one of a long-standing Lib Dem councillor, it wasn't on his thread, it was on another councillor's thread, um, came at me with, was over 75% of local authorities have had to raise their council tax by the maximum amount due to government spending cuts. And I kind of get that. I do get that. But there's a bit of me that flips that stat on its head and says, well, 1 in 4 councils then hasn't had to raise, or has chosen not to raise, by the maximum amount. But in Portsmouth, I just think that we've got into the situation where, and my dog's come to tuck his snout in my armpit, we've got to the point where we just, every party's almost given up on trying to protect the people of Portsmouth from a maxed out council tax raise. There's almost this sort of Gallic shrug, well, central government, innit, what can you do? Everybody's got to wear the 5%, and now we'll just have this, and I'll use the phrase again, this phony war about, well, we're fighting more for the people of Portsmouth because, sod the BMXers of Baffins, we've got a basketball court in Hilsey. Hooray.
So that's
Yeah.
the best argument for a change of our national government, and that I've heard you make for a while.
Well, at the end of the day, you can change the government as much as you like, and again, most people at the moment, according to opinion polls, would want to do that. But there's an element of, well, the macroeconomic issues, the credit card bill for the pandemic, the global inflationary pressures around fuel, those things remain, and those things won't go away. So there is an element of, and I think this comes to the heart of perhaps why it offends me so much as a fiscal conservative, because there's an element of, well, if you just don't have the money, then you have to tell some hard truths about the fact that some things that might have been paid for before can't be paid for now. That's the hard truth. But there's an element of, we live in a political age, and maybe this is, I'm unpacking therapeutically here. Thank you for
I
listening,
think this is a
listeners.
whole other show.
Well, there is, but
Yeah.
there's an element of we don't actually want to, and this is what I think I'm seeing in this budget is, we don't want to tell people the hard truths. So we're going to try and dress this up in the, well, you've got a this and a that and some lighting and some CCTV and so it's not so bad after all.
But even if even if all of those things were cut, even if if all of those actually deletions took place and none of those additions took place, that still wouldn't be enough to create the saving that would have been needed to avoid the increase, Ian. So I think the problem is that
Maybe
you can keep cutting, but there comes a point where you can't cut, and the things that the local council has to spend on
there was
are obligatory things. So there are,
oh,
they
no,
aren't things it can cut. So Yes, you might be able to save the odd £50,000 here, or even the odd, like, 100, the odd £250,000 here or there by not doing cycling infrastructure, for example, or doing something like that. But it's not enough to avoid the increase entirely.
No,
So,
but even in the things that you read out, Simon, and this
mm,
is the thing for me, the things that were read out and the things that, and that's where, there was £250,000 for cycling. There's the £77,000 for labour. There is £100,000. I can't remember what it was for something else. And then there's the 3.8 million that the Lib Dems, you know, they've created a 3.8 million pound hardship fund. Well, have they created that? Have they enlarged that? Is that a new thing? For me, when you've got a 2.7 million council tax rise and you're creating a 3.8 million pound hardship fund, as I say, we don't know enough. And again, but you know, it doesn't take a lot of scrutiny to find that you can see where your 2.7 million pound has gone. If that number is, if that 3.8 million claim on their social media is a new thing, it might be something that existed already, and it's just a little bit bigger this time. I don't know. I guess the macro position is for me that we've ended up with a budget that effectively means we're all going to be paying more. And if I look at all the celebrations of every local party, um, I'm not moved.
in, indeed, I mean, I guess the point to make is, rather than avoiding an increase of nearly 5% for everybody, and therefore having um, a fund that means that you can spend roughly, actually, it's more than the amount of money than that 4.99% raises, because don't forget 1.8 million of that
Yeah,
is
yeah,
going to social care.
yeah.
So only half of that, if you didn't have that 3.8 million hardship fund. But isn't it better to have an overall increase, but then target the support of the people that really need it, rather than just save everybody 5% and then not be any way to support the people that really need it? I think that's the difference between, forgive me, that's the, we, we, I'll I'll go in on a second to kind of the social media war. Um, but that's the difference between a progressive position of redistributive taxation and a position of just lowering taxation overall. And that, I think, is the fundamental kind of politics behind the idea. George Madrick, frequent contributor to the show, disagrees that it's a phony wall, and says that what happens in the meetings where these things are discussed and behind the scenes, the debates and negotiations about what matters, that matter to each party, but we are advised by officers in relation to the need of the council tax increase. So we decided it was better to get a little something that matters to each of us for all of our communities than to get sod all. So I guess that's kind of why those, if you like, those paybacks to those particular there's different wards that are getting particular things that they're needing to kind of offset that. So I think there's probably a wider conversation to have about the nature of that taxation policy overall, but fundamentally you can only pay for certain things, and if actually less than half of your income is from council tax, and the amount that you get from other things is being forever reduced by central government, but the actual cost and the number of things that you are mandated by law to pay for with the money that you get,
Yep.
there's only so many different ways you can go.
Oh,
We, sh- we sh-
absolutely, Simon. And I think that's I guess the
mm,
piece for me which isn't clear
mm,
in this is how much of that 94 million is mandatory and how much of it is discretionary. And I guess that's the piece where we would have to do a lot of research into digging into almost line by line items.
mhm.
And I think that's where I'm struggling a little bit, because the line items we've talked about are, mm, Yeah, kind of okay.
Yeah,
But yes, back onto the agenda.
and there's also a difference between what a unitary authority like Portsmouth has to pay for compared to other councils like Havant, for example, who don't have to pay for certain public services because those are actually paid for and organised by Hampshire County Council. Hampshire
Yep,
County Council in the news recently, at risk of bankruptcy. So there's a whole wider conversation to unpick. But you're right; it would be really
yep,
interesting to see what the ratio is between the discretionary spend and the mandated spend. But we
yep,
must come back. Thank you for reminding me. We must come back to the point that Emily eagle-eyed spotted in the comments there. That tweet. So the amendments, all of the amendments fell. So the Conservative amendment, the Labour amendment, and the ex-Labour Cal Corkery and Kirsty Mellor amendment, they all fell. None of
yes,
those amendments passed. So I'm sure it's just an error on it's an error by tweet. I'm sure that has Labour claiming that their amendment has passed because their amendment didn't pass. They did, however, vote for the budget overall, as did everybody else. Returning to George's point, because the alternative is basically we either vote through a budget that works or there's nothing, and the council can't function. So you are kind of put over the barrel a little bit in the sense of that way the group amendment was subsumed by the council,
yes, yep,
and then voted through unanimously by in the council chamber. That is, I understand, a recorded vote for budget meetings, but the minutes of Tuesday's budget meeting aren't yet out, as far as we know. So thank you to those councillors that gave me a bit of background or gave us a bit of background on what actually happened with the amendments and what happened
yep.
actually with the voting, because otherwise we'd have been in the dark. And then we pause.
Indeed. So, have you got much else on from the social media archives post meeting?
No, that was it
That's us.
basically. For
Yeah.
me, the interesting comparison was
Yep.
how each of those two parties chose to talk about those things. When not all of those things were things that actually happened as a result of what happened in that budget meeting. Some of those things actually had already been announced,
Yes.
and some of those things were things that actually other people suggested. So it's really kind of strange how people claim ownership of things that they either did or didn't do, or perhaps they have some involvement behind the scenes. We're not obviously privy to every single conversation about it, but it's interesting. Like you say, it's the art of writing a leaflet. It's almost like there's an election coming up.
Well, and to be fair, George is on the. He was one of the people that I had a discussion with about on just this very topic. In terms of, there is, my frustration at the moment with local politics is that everybody claims victory for everything, and again, then accuses the opposition party or the party that's not them of doing something. Oh, how underhand of them claiming something, claiming responsibility for something that wasn't just down to them. So, there is this element where, if we look at the positives, it has been harmonious. We've seen cross-party working to acknowledge George's point. Everybody's got a bit of something out of it. I think the piece for me, which is the huge unanswered question, is how are those 1 in 4 councils that aren't hitting all of their residents with a maxed out rise again? What are they doing differently to Portsmouth? And what is it we should be learning from them? To try and spare the people from Portsmouth from another maxed out rise next year. And it's that element of, well, the macroeconomic elements of the wage rises and the staff shortages and inflationary pressures, they're the same for all councils. So there's somebody somewhere doing it, quote unquote, either better or, and that's to your point about fiscal conservatism versus wealth redistribution, or is doing it, or maybe Portsmouth is doing it better by hammering those that can afford to pay or can't avoid not paying, to give the money to those that can't.
Indeed. So yeah, there's more to, as it's one of those stories that isn't you never arrive at kind of an end point, is it? It's one of those things that go on, but they are the decisions made
Yes,
are practical, and as George has said, you have to kind of reach some sort of agreement. So in some respect, it's the art of compromise, isn't it? Everybody has to kind of come away with something to feel that they've been able to win something for the people that they represent, and I guess that's how that works. Because the only other way that would work without needing to have that would be if there was a political party that had an overall majority. On Portsmouth City Council, and there isn't, and that's not mathematically likely for some time. Compromise is not a new thing, and it's not going away anytime soon in Portsmouth.
absolutely. Absolutely. So I guess our mind must turn to next week, and am I right? We're finally going to get to a voter ID.
We are indeed. So we have spoken about this before. So those listeners that follow us will know that we've wanted to do this for a little while. But next week, 6:27, join us as we'll be going into exploring what ID you're going to need to have with you to be able to vote in person on May the 4th, and how you can go about getting free photo ID if you don't have any. And
Yep.
there is still plenty of time to actually apply for these things, to test it out. I applied for my voter authority certificate the Saturday before last, and I got it through the post on the Thursday afterwards. So not even 6 days had passed, and I actually got mine through the post. So you can apply online for one. So we'll go through all of that next week, 6:27. Join us live on Facebook or YouTube. Please do. Follow the event so you get a notification. But if you like, follow, or subscribe us, however you enjoy us, then you'll be able to make sure that you don't miss out on that important episode.
Marvelous. So you've been listening to the Pompey Politics podcast. I've been Ian, paying an extra 4.99%. Morris.
And I've been Simon Sansbury, who will also be paying an extra 4.99%. And I'm happy to, because I know that it's going on good things.
Boo.